name is Tio. My full name is Tihomir. I've been at Temporal for a while. I had a pleasure, actually, I think, to interact with a lot of people in this room. I see a lot of familiar faces. And of course, thank you for being here. Of course, in this room, and also thank you for being at the conference. And it was always my pleasure to talk to each and every one of you. A little bit about myself. I tried to put like a word cloud of what I kind of currently working on, but I'm not the only one. I am only one of many people at Temporal who is helping our users and customers and the whole community doing all of these things and much, much more. So just on our product team itself, we have our development success engineering team, which I'm part of. We have solution architecture, we have marketing, we have education, we have DevRel, all these different teams that combine, we work together in order to interact with our community, our users, and all of you guys, that in the end, we want your success and we want you to be successful in using Temporal. But then there is even more. There is a whole engineering team at Temporal, and everyone in engineering in some sort of shape, way is also helping in every step of the way for all of our users. One thing that I wanted to bring up is this, and I want you guys to all remember this before anything else. All our interactions, especially this is important to me, my interactions with you go beyond just the technical aspect of things. There is a human aspect to everything that we do. And the human aspect, especially in what we call support, is something that is very dear to me, that I really try to kind of use and remember. And no matter what the situation is that we interact with, whether it's online or on Zoom or Slack or here in person, we should all remember, hey, we were humans before we engineers. So when you interact with each other and outside, take that to heart, please. About this talk, actually, it's POC to production. I personally have talked to a lot of our users, both cloud customers, community users. Everybody has a use case, everybody has an application, and everybody has a different business. So the journey from when you start working with Temporal, learning about Temporal, your initial questions of how does this thing even work, to actually running a successful load test, to actually moving your application to production and serving it to your customers is unique to you, right? Even though we talk to so many different companies, we do see patterns. Two applications that maybe one person here and another on the other side of the room might be completely different, but they're going to have some best practices and patterns or some parts of their implementation which we can help with, right? As the teams, different teams are there talking to you. So the kind of thing about this talk is I really want to share with you one thing and one thing only, how to put yourself in the best position to be successful. And what we're going to do during this talk is not something that you might be doing. It's not going to use the tools that you might be using. But one thing I hope that you get out of this is kind of to follow the thought process, the thinking and stuff like that as we go through, a little bit of a demo and things like that, and try to see how you can apply that in your use case, in your business, of course, when using Temporal. So one thing that I kind of want to drive, and this is the last slide. For people who actually like the slides, I'm sorry for that, I have to disappoint you. But at this point, when I came to this slide, I had to make a decision. Either I go safe and have another 30 slides of quote-unquote best practices where I put bullet points on that, or I take a little bit of a chance and hopefully it'll work out, and I'll try to do a demo. And I decided to go ahead and be a little crazy and try that. But throughout what we do now, think about these steps, all right? And this is not only related to Temporal, this is anything that you do. How do you make sure that you test what you do? How do you observe your workflow executions, your applications? How do you detect failures? How do you detect errors or possible things that you can improve? Now, once you detect something, how do you understand what you have detected? And that's also a very important step that a lot of people in the end miss. And finally, the goal of everything is to improve, whether that be performance, whether that be a user experience, customer experience, or anything else that you do. In the end, this is going to be the end goal. So this is an iterative process, and this picture doesn't show it. And that's kind of what I want you to get out of it. So as far as the demo goes, we're going to actually start up some services. And I'm going to run everything on Docker. I hope you guys don't mind. So currently we have our Docker Compose. We have this thing called My Temporal Docker Compose. This is basically a Docker Compose repo for temporal service. And it's going to run a couple of front ends, couple of matching, couple of history services. It's got Envoy up front, all this thing. And the cool thing about that is I will show you later, this is all on GitHub. Everything that I'm going to do today and showcase, you can do it yourself on your laptop probably right after, or even can try it during that time. Now, another thing we have to do is we have to start, and I'll make this bigger, our services. The first thing that we're going to do is start our client service. I'm sorry, the light is detached. All right, so right now I'm starting our client service, and we can see it started on Docker as a container. The next thing I'm going to start, and this is something that you're going to do eventually, you probably, if you run the samples, run it on your local machine. We're going to run our worker. So let's start that up too. All right. So the demo is going to have two parts, and let's go to here. And when we go to the client, you will see this is it. It's got two parts, two buttons. That's all it is. The first button is we're going to focus on how do we detect problems? How do we understand problems? And how do we fix problems with our workflow execution? The second part is going to be more of like, let's put a load in our system and then follow the same kind of steps of the last slide that we've shown, which is detection, testing, detection, observation, and finally, how do we improve what we're running. All right, so when I click on here, actually, this button, all this is going to do is this client is going to start about 20, 30 workflow executions, and that's it. Now, okay, demo done, right? Now, so how can I actually see? There's a couple of things when you're starting to go from a POC to production environment is how you kind of evolve in seeing what's going on with the temporal system. The first thing you probably do is run temporal CLI. So I can say temporal workflow list. And I can see here, okay, I have a whole bunch of running executions, right? Another thing that I can do is, of course, go to the web UI, and I see also my workflow executions running here. Now, here comes the intuition part. I know that my workflow only invokes two activities that run for about a second, right? And the workflow execution should take about 2 seconds, but I see they're all running, right? So why are my executions still running? How do I detect that? How do I figure out what's going on with my system? Well, the first thing that I can do is, we have a worker here. Is this thing actually polling, right? If you remember, workflow executions in temporal have to coordinate between the service and your workers, right? The service is responsible for creating and managing your workflow executions, but your workers are the one that actually run your code, right? So in order for a workflow execution to go from creation to completion, there has to be communication between the service and your workers, right? So let's take a look at how I would initially look for that. Well, I can again go to temporal CLI and run a command called task queue describe. Now, a task queue is an endpoint. When my client started workflow execution, it asked the service to start all those workflow executions on an endpoint. Think about it as a URI, right? My worker then is supposed to talk to the service, and the service tells him, hey, please process your workflow code for this execution. Also is responsible to talk to the same endpoint. And if I see here, okay, I have some identity, this is my worker, and it's been polling on this task queue for, this shows the last 2 minutes at least, right? But this still doesn't help me with my problem, right? So let's take a look at the web UI. In the web UI, if I click on one of these executions, I can see this thing on top called workers, right? This is going to show me the list of workers similar to the CLI command we just ran for this particular task queue for this execution. Now here, if you see on the right side, I'm getting another clue, right? And the clue is on the right-hand side, workflow task handler and activity handler. Your workers, when you deploy them by default, are both workflow handlers and activity handlers, right? So your workers can process both workflow tasks, meaning progress of your workflow code, and activities, meaning execution of the activities that are invoked by your workflow code. And here is a little bit of a clue right here. There is an X next to activity handler, meaning what? My worker is not polling for activities. And that kind of gives me another clue. So now what do I do, right? Let's check my worker. And if I go to my worker here, the workers are your deployments. You use the Temporal SDKs to create your workers. You deploy them as you would other applications. That means you can expose REST endpoints on your worker processes, right? So this is a bit of a custom endpoint that shows me my worker information. And under registered worker resources, I see, okay, I have 2 workflows registered on this worker, but I don't have any activities registered in the worker. Now I'm getting another clue. My workers are not making any progress because my worker doesn't have any activities registered. And when a worker doesn't have any activities registered, it's not going to poll for any activity tasks. Okay, so I have a good understanding now from doing all of these 10 things that most likely I need to change my worker code to see if I registered the activity. But quite frankly, this looks like a lot of work to me. This is good for a POC, but a lot of you guys run millions and millions of workflow executions, right? And you cannot do this for every single execution that you have to figure out why stuff is happening. And this is the type of progress from POC to production code. And one thing that can actually help with that, sorry, I gotta go to my clients, is metrics, right? How many people here have SDK metrics for your applications? Raise your hand. That's not a lot, all right? I don't see a lot of hands. This whole room should have raised their hands. This is one of the things when we talk about how do I go from POC to production. This comes up a lot. SDK metrics, if you're on-prem, service metrics, if you're on cloud observability metrics. Please set those up. But here I'm running Grafana locally, and we can actually see some dashboards. And this dashboard doesn't tell much, but we see here on started workflows, we see that we have started workflows, and we saw them running in our web UI and through the CLI. We also see that we don't have any completed workflows. So there isn't much indication, except here we have an alert. And this alert is an activity task pulse. With metrics, all of these things that we did with the web UI, with the CLI, all these things, we can easily write Grafana dashboard with the server's metric that says, tell me all the activity pollers from all the workers that you have on this task queue. And we see also an alert. And that is another thing I wanted to talk about. In addition to just viewing metrics, we can actually write alerts. And here we can see under alert rules that we have one alert firing. And this alert says no activity polls for workflow. And this is kind of like when you start evolving from POC, use metrics, have alerts, understand the metrics. I know it's not easy, but we're going to help you. So here I can figure out the same thing. Now that I know for sure that I'm not registering activities on my worker, let's go to the code. Now I'm using Spring Boot here. So all my configuration for my worker is going to be done via properties, right? So different SDKs, of course, would do it differently. But yes, of course, under activity, beans, that's a Spring Boot thing and Java thing, but just activities. Somebody forgot to comment this. So let's go ahead and enable. But now what? We have to actually compile this code and we have to redeploy our worker, right? So let's go ahead back to our terminal and say we're using Maven. And for this, I'm just going to skip test and we'll talk about tests. Don't worry about that as well. But I have to compile my code and then I have to redeploy it on my Docker. And let's see if this is going to happen. All right, so we redeployed our worker. Our Spring app is starting up to host our workers. And let's see what happens now. Okay, now let's go back to our worker, this worker in Docker Compose. Let's see if now we see on this page it does have the 2 activities registered, so we're good there. But let's take a look what happens with our workflow executions. They're still in running state, right? What do we do now? Let's see if anything is actually progressing. So let's take a look at one. And we see here, this is the event history. This is very important to understand. It's useful for debugging, not only when you're running Hello World applications, but also when you're doing production. A lot of times when we're working with users that are running production systems, often the communication between us and the user is through the event history. Oftentimes you have code that you cannot share, but through this event history, we can together debug and figure out possibly what the issue is and how that translates into some problems and fixes in your workflow code. So we see here that our first activity, we unblocked for it by registering our activities on our worker. But now we're kind of stuck here at activity task scheduled event for our second activity, right? And this comes up a lot. My workflow is stuck, and this is something that we work with. At this point, we have to figure out what's going on. And it's not always easy, all right? It could be a number of things in this situation. One thing that we tell users, I don't know how many times, is what happens when the activity task is scheduled, but you don't see an activity task started event? It doesn't mean much. You see activity task started when the activity actually completes. And this is an optimization in the event history. So this really, at this point, we have to look at something called pending activities. And pending activities will tell us that our second activity actually is pending, meaning it's executing. And a worker picked it up, and it's currently at attempt 1, right? So from this alone, I have an idea. Okay, my worker is picking up this particular activity, but something is going on. So let's take a look at and see what's going on. And for that, let's go back to our metrics dashboard for our dashboards. And what we see something here. And this is actually a graph that shows activity completion resource exhausted. What does this mean, right? By itself, it doesn't mean much, but we know that we're communicating between our workers and the service through gRPC. We know that resource exhausted is one of the codes for gRPC, but we still don't know exactly why. And that's, in addition to metrics, one important thing to look into is also worker logs, right? This particular container for a worker uses this Loki plugin to push its logs over to Grafana. So as a dashboard, we also have worker logs. And if we look at the worker logs, we see this message right here. What does this mean? It says, resource exhausted, gRPC received message larger than max. gRPC has a 4 megabyte limit, right, size limit. And what this actually means is that this worker is trying to respond back with activity results, and the activity results are greater than the max, which is the 4 MB gRPC size. Okay, this also comes up a lot. There are limitations when you are working with data sets in Temporal, or in this case, it has nothing to do with Temporal. It has to do with the gRPC size itself. So now I have a pretty good idea. We're stuck in activity called second. We are probably returning a very large result. So let's go to our code and try to figure out what's going on. And this is a bunch of Java stuff. But long story short, I can see that somebody wrote code that returns the sample JPEG as the activity result. And this is what we're trying to return. It's probably what I'll see tomorrow when we all fly back. But this is 5.27 meg. Okay, so what are we going to do in this case? There is a bunch of different solutions to this, and I'm not going to go into details. But when you're dealing with such large data sets, sometimes it's useful to store them in an S3 bucket, sometimes and store them in a database. Sometimes it's okay also to store it on the worker memory, right, of the file system, or in memory of the worker process itself, depending on the use case. But for this use case, we're going to pretend that we're going to store it somewhere, let's say an S3 bucket, and just return the reference to it. So right now, let's pretend this image JPEG is on the S3. I'm going to return the URI to the S3 bucket, and my next activity can process it again if it needs to process this image or the result of my activity. All right. So now at this point, I have to build my worker again because I made a change. And is anybody going to stop me at this point? We don't want to skip our tests at this point, right? One important thing, if you get anything out of this, please run your tests all the time. And there are two types of tests that we have for this demo. One is validity of our workflow execution, which validates that the changes that we just made to our activity won't break our workflow. But probably more so important for you, and something that if you get anything out of it, please use workflow replayer tests in your tests. Every SDK has them. It's a bit different code for every single one. But learn about workflow replayer, please. If you next time we see each other and you're out using workflow replayer in your test, we're not gonna. I might get a little mad. So let's go ahead and run. This is going to run both of our tests. This is the unit test for our workflow execution, as well as the replayer test. We'll just wait a second. All right. Spring is being interesting. All right. So now we can deploy. All right, so this is going to redeploy our worker container, okay? And let's go ahead and see what's happening with our workflow executions. And they're still running, and we see some are starting to get completed already. And we can also look, of course, at our metrics. And we see, let's see, this might take a little second or two to update. And we're waiting we don't want to see any more of these status messages, and we want this to go to 0, all right? So let's go ahead and pick one of the executions in the web UI that completed. And we can see that we unblocked from the second activity, and we were able to complete the workflow execution. Now this is, you might say, what's this workflow task timeout? This can happen sometimes during worker restarts and things like that. All right, we got about 5 more minutes, so I'm just going to jump to the second part if that's okay, right? Real quick. And finally, we were able, I think, to complete all our workflow executions. All right, so let's go back to our client and start the second test. The second test has more to do with worker tuning. So what this is going to do is start a whole bunch of workflow executions and like in every half a second or something like that, and continue doing so. So we're trying to simulate to produce a load on our system. So if we go back to our web UI, we should start seeing a demo 2 running execution. It's going to keep going and going and going and going. All right. One thing that we're going to start looking at metrics again. And one thing that we're going to focus on in this case is a couple of other things. There is things called schedule to start latencies between workflow tasks being delivered from the service to your workers, activity schedule to start latencies for activity tasks, and things like that. And here we can kind of see a couple of things. We have very high activity schedule to start latencies. Our workers are struggling to process our activity tasks. We also have something called sync polls and async polls, which tell us how fast our single worker is able to process these workflow and activity tasks. And we see that it's probably, there is a lot of async. And then at the end, we have this ratio between these two, which are going to give us an indication of our worker performance. So we see for a workflow task, we're pretty good. But if we look at activities, our sync match rate is probably very low. This should be around 1, meaning 100%. So what do we do about that? And just for the matter of time, we're just going to jump a little bit, and we're going to look at our application properties again, and we're going to look at what's called capacity in Spring Boot. These are your worker options. And there is a bunch of different worker options, but it resolves around 3 things. Number of pollers, how they actually deliver tasks to your workers, number of executors, which is concurrent processing of workflow and activity tasks, and the cache size, which will, kind of is a topic on its own. So one thing that we see here is that we're limiting only on one activity execution a task to be processed. So let's change that to 200. Now, this is an iterative process. Don't just change numbers like I do willy-nilly. This is what we do in Worker Tuning session, and we go through a lot of different things. Important thing here is to look at your CPU and memory utilization in your worker pods, and all these things, there is a process to that. Another thing, let's increase the number of activity pollers. And we're going to, let's say, increase the total number of threads because we want to increase the cache size or how much executions we're caching on their worker. So real quick, if I have only 2 more minutes to build our application. And now, if I redeploy this worker alone, it might not be enough to solve our issue of having optimized workers for this use case. Oftentimes, scaling is also necessary. So the idea is to scale a single worker until you feel comfortable with it. At that point, scaling becomes replication. So one thing that we're going to do is, in addition of running this, we're also going to scale up our workers to 5, okay? I think this completed. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to restart this worker that we have and start 4 more. So if we look at our Docker Compose, now we have 5 workers. And let's look at one and see if our, this one hasn't started yet. Sorry. This one probably started. Our configurations got picked up. And just for the last thing, and this might take, I'm sorry, a minute or 2 to show, but what we're looking at is our sync polls go up, meaning our workers now 5 with updated configuration, basically ability to process more activity tasks, are picking up more tasks sync, which means very fast. Our async polls are eventually going to go down. And one thing that we're going to focus on here, and hopefully if we have a couple more seconds, it will update, is our sync match rate for especially activity tasks, which should eventually go up. And if we had maybe 1 more minute, you will see these lines converge at about 1, which means 100%, meaning we were able to help optimize our workers at this point. All right, I think we're done, right? All right, thank you guys so much. I hope you enjoyed it and have a great day.